Yeah, that was fun too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, doing spring break, so they're looking at me.
I think I just went in
No, it's, and I moved your pocketbook because I'm now falling. Oh, no, it's all right. I moved it. Because I turned around and tried to get something and it was yours not. So they don't need to do anything. Sit down. Thank you for, it's so nice to have you on. We expected you all now. Thank you. We start? This is also being changed.
so the way YouTube works, it's just going to save it automatically.
Should we shut the door? Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This is pretty exciting. This is my first event at the Spring Rights Literary Festival. I'm Robin Schwartz. Oh, I'm Robin Schwartz. I'm the program and grant director of the New York's Partnership. Spring Rights is one of our events. There are 40 events, and springrights.org, I have to spell it. It's spring, WRITS.org. Please check out all the other events. A lot of them are on Zoom, and the live ones are mostly live streamed. So before I talk about tonight's event, I want to thank our sponsors. And I did not memorize them yet, but by the 40th event, I will have memorized them. Our sponsors for Spring Rights are Wegmans, the Downtown Ithaca Marriott, M&T Bank, Ithaca College, CFCU Community Credit Union, the Odyssey Bookstore. Our media sponsors are Cinemapolis, WSKG, WITH Radio, and the Ithaca Voice. And then we get additional support from poets and writers, New York State Council on the Arts, and the Tompkins County Tourism Program. Tonight's event, Hearing Voices, Writers and Their Inspiration, originally had 3 writers, but Ann Mazer can't be with us tonight. So we have Susan Currie and Carol Kammen. And we're going to start the event by, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Carol. And come on up and we'll get going. Thank you everyone for being here.
I trust this is all right. I think we all owe Robin a round of applause. She has done an amazing amount of work coordinating 40 events, 400 people, 70% of whom probably didn't do what she told them the first time, including me. And thank you, Robin, so much. This is a great event.
I call my job an artist wrangler.
You didn't have to wrangle. We were very pleased to be gathered up in your last event. I'm Carol Kammen, and I have been the county historian for a lot of years. And I want to present tonight to you something that is not history, and I feel a great need to defend myself. So I'm going to start with Gore Vidal, about whom I'm sure you all know. Gore Vidal said history was too important to leave to the historians. So then he went and wrote about 6 historical novels that were historical fiction, and the historians hated all of them and complained about him. And they complained about him for at least 30 years. So he is sort of the person who says that there's good stuff in history, and then he did it, and everybody was upset about it. I came to Ithaca a long time ago, in 1965, actually, and I was very struck by 3 historic markers. One was the Parker marker, Parker Street, which runs, a little street runs between East Buffalo and Seneca. And it was to Reverend Samuel Parker, about whom I knew a great deal. And then I looked up and found more. Parker was the person who responded to the Nez Perce request for educators to come out to see them. They went to St. Louis in 1834 and asked for educators, and Parker said, "That's for me." And he went out and he decided that he would cite mission sites. So Parker went to out to Oregon. On his way out of New York State, he took with him Marcus Whitman, who was a newly minted doctor. And halfway to Oregon, he said, "Marcus, you go home and marry that nice Miss Prentice and come back next year with a whole batch of people." So Marcus Whitman turns around and goes home and then returns to Oregon in 1843. But before Marcus Whitman gets there, there is someone else who goes. And that person, and there's a marker at the Presbyterian Church in the DeWitt Park to the Whitman mission, because Marcus Whitman and Narcissa Prentice left from Ithaca with a man who was also from Ithaca named William Gray, and they went west. But there's a third sign in Tompkins County. And the third one is to Dr. Elijah White, who was, and it says on the sign, medical missionary to the Oregon Territory. And he went in 1835 to the Willamette Mission, and he was fired by the Willamette Mission for pressing his female patients. And I wanted to know more about Dr. Elijah White, so I spent many, many years and found out that he was, after he was fired from the Methodist Mission, he came back to the East, and he was one of the few people in the East who knew anything about the Pacific Northwest. So we went to Washington at the request of Secretary of Defense Spencer, and he told them all about the West, how wonderful it was, why we should make sure we get it, the British do not. And they said to him, would you take pioneers to the West? And White, who had never been across the country because he had gone by ship to the Oregon Territory, said, "Of course I can." And he turns out to be a very slimy character. And I followed him for years in various libraries all over the country. In 1842, he was in St. Louis, and he put some notices in the newspaper that he wanted to take a company of families west. And this is the beginning of what's called the Oregon Trail. And because I was interested in Dr. White and how devious he was, I followed up and then wrote a really, really boring history of that crossing in 1842. And after I threw that out, I realized what was missing, and that is there were no women's voices. There were 109 people who went across to Oregon with Dr. White. They all didn't get there, but most of them did. And in the records and in the census he took in 1842 in Oregon, there were indications of 12 women. And I wanted to know what they thought about. Now, there are dozens of novels about the Oregon Trail. There are dozens of histories about the Oregon Trail, and I didn't want to write any one of them. I had tried, and I thought what I did was awful. So I began to think who these 12 women were and what they would say to each other and what they would think. And while there are lots and lots of novels about women who go west, and there are records of women who went west, there is nothing from this crossing, this first crossing of families in 1842. And I knew the names of the women, and I began to wonder how they responded to what they were doing. They didn't have any models. They didn't know that there could be trouble from the Native Americans. They didn't know that the land was so great. They didn't know they were going to have to walk for 2,000 plus miles from Missouri to Oregon. They didn't know what the trail was going to be like. They had no power. In the novels about the Oregon Trail, and especially the recent ones, there are all sorts of women who appear as mothers, daughters, wives, sirens, seductresses. And there's even one novel about a brothel that takes itself from the east to go west because there were lots of men out there. I didn't want to write any of those things. So I began to imagine what these women would think about. And I really was interested in how they contemplated the West, what they thought they were doing, where they thought they were going, what they were leaving behind, and the things they could not say out loud because there were social conventions, there were religious strictures, there was a tremendous sense of privacy about things unspoken, especially having to do with the body. Women might help each other when there was childbirth, and women certainly knew about childbirth, but they didn't talk about many other things having to do with bodily functions. And I wanted that to be part of what I tried to explore. So I began with a woman named Caroline Tompkins. Her name was not Tompkins, it was Smith, but because there were 6 Smiths on this journey, I had to change the name. So her husband turns out to be Danby Tompkins, and only people in Tompkins County will get that small little joke, and I'm not a very funny person, but that's my big joke for today. And I wanted to know what she thought, mother of 4 people. How did she cope? I wanted to know what Mary, who was from Alabama, what she thought. She is the young woman who was traded by her father for a debt of $37 to a man named Barnum Bennett. What did she think of the trip? I wanted to know what the widow Abel thought, who had left a difficult situation in Indiana and went west, not caring where she went. She just needed to get away from the situation in Indiana. I wanted to know what Susanna Cooch thought. And Susanna is the only fictional character in the book. Everybody else comes from the census, but I needed Susanna to follow a theme that I was following, that I was interested in. And then there's Susan Perry, and the person who speaks the most is probably Mary Smith, an older woman who grew up in outside of Troy, who lived most of her life looking at Lake Erie in Cattaraugus County, and then who goes west because it's her son's dream, and she wants to make sure her son can have his dream. They left St. Louis on the 17th of May. They got to Oregon on the 4th of October. They walked the entire way in rain, in sleet, in darkness, in good weather, in heat, with grasshoppers, all manner of problems facing them. And these women had been told that it would be an interesting journey. So the Christian Advocate, which was advocating for people to go west, said women will have no work on this trip, and they can go and enjoy the flowers, and it will be a vacation for them. Well, of course, it wasn't any of those things, but that was the propaganda of the day. So these are the women I had to deal with. And Mary Smith was 63 when she went west. And on the 22nd of July, all the events that happened came from a journal. It was kept by the company clerk that told everyone how far they went and what the weather was. Basically, that's all his journal had. And I used every event from his journal. And so this is a true thing that happened. Mary Smith, on the 22nd of July, said, this is where I will try to read to you. She said, she responded to the fact that the Indians, and she called them Indians and she called them Sioux, they were probably Lakota, Lakota abandoned the Sioux, but she doesn't say that. Mary Smith sees them come up to where the camp of the immigrants are. They ride swiftly up, and they bring with them 20 very fine horses. And they ride up to the company. They stop right short in front of them, and the horses are there because they want to trade the horses for a young woman named Jane to give her to a chief. And the people in the company say, we don't sell our daughters. And the Indians say back to them, but we sell our daughters to you all the time. You bring us pots and you bring us rifles and bullets. We do it, why don't you do it? So there is this impasse with the Indians wanting to take Jane with them for a chief to become his wife. And they're all on their horses and they're coming at the company, stop right in front of the company. And Mary Smith's response is, the Indians have surprised me. Not their wanting Jane, although that was surprising, but their very presence. I always thought of Indians as a way, as being elsewhere, doing their Indian things, as enemies and as helpers, perhaps. But when a group of Sioux rode up to our camp at a fierce speed, then stopped short and dismounted, they were not only individuals on the piece of land I am calling home at that moment, but they were a very physical presence. We are not supposed to notice that they are naked. We women, that is. Well, not totally naked, but from their hips to their necks, they wear nothing but some painted designs. Their chests gleam in the sunlight, which seems to bounce off of them, making them appear like gods, each with his own aura. I never saw such shoulders, arms, legs, hands. They have robes thrown around their lower parts of their body, and they move gracefully. They startle me as I wrestle with a long skirt and long sleeves and a bonnet to shield my eyes, but I could not go as they. Their skin is so bronzed, so gleaming. I can also see the scars they bear, the ones they make on their skin for whatever purpose, and the scars of wounds they have borne. I am very conscious of their nakedness, and I'm an old married woman. So this is what I had Mary Smith say, and here's where I have 3 problems. The first is that I'm a historian, and as a historian, I want you to believe what I'm telling you. And now I'm a first-time, one-time only novelist, and I want you to believe this too. But obviously, Mary Smith, whose name is on the roster, didn't say any of these things. I was hearing Mary Smith in my head, and I heard Mary Smith and the other dozen women for months. In fact, sometimes I still hear them. So in my head, hearing Mary, I began to hear what they were saying, and I intuited that Mary Smith would respond to the fact that these warriors, they were all men, were bronzed and that they were naked basically from the hips up. And as a historian, I have read tremendous numbers of accounts of women who went west and of histories of women who went west, even novels of women who went west. And none of them mentioned the fact that the women from the East were responding to these warriors, these men, in terms of their bodily presence. My second problem is dealing with the Native Americans, because we have all become very conscious that Native Americans are not just Indians. There are many different cultures. We have greater respect for them today than they did in those days. We also are guilty, are conscious of the fact that this wagon train, which is part of manifest destiny, that it is our right to this whole continent, really was a very misguided idea, that there were people here, there were people with cultures here, there were people with families here, but we ran right past them and went over them. So dealing with Native Americans today is difficult, and I did so very carefully. And so I'm presenting this group of Indians coming up the wagon train. My third problem in writing this is one that I'm sure you will understand, and that is I very much needed not to give the women in this 1842 journey the sensibilities that I have today or that I've lived with since the 1960s when I began to be a little bit more sensible than when I was a teen. And that's hard because when you read a lot of the novels, especially about the West, there is a woman who stops the wagon train and saves it. There's a woman who somehow holds back the Indians and saves things. There's a woman who, finds a way across the river. These are women doing things that the women in 1842 would not have done. There's just no way. And so I wanted to be true to the 1840s and yet give them a personality and a life and a consciousness of what they were doing. So Mary Smith sees these people coming and she doesn't run up there and stop them, which is what some of these novels would do. And she doesn't bargain with them because they're not going to bargain with her. She's an old woman. They're going to bargain with some male in the company, probably the father of the young girl they want. She has no power role. She has no agency in this. She is an observer. So what I have her doing is observing the physicality of these people, which is not something women in the 19th century wrote about at all about men. So I've made a leap. And this began to scare me. I wondered if maybe I had made a leap too far because I had never read about this in anything. And then I went to see an old friend of mine, someone even older than I am. And I told her what I was wrestling with. And she said, wait. She went to her desk and pulled out a letter that an ancestor of hers who had crossed on the Oregon Trail in the 1860s had written. And that ancestor said they were naked and we saw their nakedness and it was strange to us. And I felt justified in an interesting way. I thought maybe I wasn't too far off. So, so I kept writing, and Lamentations is the book that has derived from that. I would like to read you the last little sentence that Mary Smith says. She has described the Indians in what she sees as nakedness. They're not naked, but they're bronzed bodies. And she said, all of this is too private, almost too sacrilegious to even tell my husband or my friends. I can't talk about this. There are things we cannot talk about. Yet, Jesus is often shown in the same clothing while on the cross, without the paint, of course, but there he is. These are not gods, and was he. So it causes in her a sense of not a crisis of faith, but a questioning of faith. And I thought that was an important thing to do. So Mary Smith becomes a voice of a person who questions where she is, who questions the fact that she is going across the country, leaving behind her family, the rest of her family, leaving behind the graveyard where her relatives were buried, leaving behind her house and the whole society. And she knows she can't talk about that with the people at home either, because if she were to say, I really hate to leave the graveyard, they'll say, so stay. So she has this questioning mind, and I found her wonderful to listen to. And I can tell you that I started out with names. I gave them characters. So the characters are mine. I might have gotten some of them wrong. I have one very cranky lady, and she's always complaining about something, and she was the most fun to write. And I have some teenage girls, and I have this panoply of women in their middle age. We have 12 women in all, so it's not a huge palette. And I began to write them And then I began to hear them. And then it was not automatic writing, but then they began to tell me what to say. And I felt with Mary Smith that I had gotten a couple of things. Thank you so much. Now we have Susan Currie, whom all of you know as the former director of this library and a great community person.
Thank you, Susan. I just want to show them.
Oh, I forgot.
That's okay.
I forgot. Number 6. I'm supposed to do number 6.
It's about, yeah.
I did it.
It might be a little.
All right, let me get out of your way.
I'm going to show you, because I'm going to show you the picture of her book,
Wait,
which is
there's
fabulous.
a cord here. Okay, don't trip on it. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Okay, I did number
This is
6.
the map that, that Carol was referencing. This is in the front of her book.
And at the top, you'll see it says Samuel Parker. And it's the map, his book about his journey west. Yeah. Up at the top under map of Oregon, right there, it says Samuel Parker.
And then,
Can you show them the cover?
oh, yes, I thought it did. There it is. And I have questions for Carol. I'm sure you do too, but if you can hang on to them and remember them. So the map, and then these were, if you go to the University of Nebraska Bison Press, where you for the book, you can see inside the book, and these were some of the quotes. I thought they were really interesting because they reference back what Carol was saying about some of her inspiration for some of the story. So thank you, Carol. I have to say I really enjoyed that book. So I'm going to talk about a different kind of story. The title of this session is Writers and Their Inspiration. My inspiration is a very personal experience. It's a book that I've written. It's a memoir of a specialized hospital that I was in for 15 months as a child. And actually, my inspiration for this came actually when children were being taken away from parents at the border, because these hospitals existed at a time. Children were often taken from parents and placed in these specialized hospitals for very specific reasons. They were called preventoriums, as in preventing. They were very prevalent during the years of tuberculosis. In the early 1900, actually, tuberculosis was a disease that was killing many people. They were trying to figure out what to do. The American Tuberculosis Association, which later became the American Lung Association that we know today, had worldwide conferences, and that's where the tuberculosis sanitariums began to be set up all over the country. Out of that grew this preventive hospital movement for children who were considered at risk. They believed they were doing the right thing. But this is a picture of the preventorium in Mississippi, where I was a patient for 15 months. Ironically, I don't know how many people know this, but the Cuban Nature Center in Tompkins County was a preventorium. It was a Cuba preventorium for 20 years. There were preventoriums in almost every state. There was one in Saranac Lake, Lake Placid. There were some in Farmingdale. So they were very prevalent. So it's a very personal memoir, and it was a little difficult to write because I had some really strange experiences. But anyway, I'll just start by then. A long time ago, I was one among many of a group of discarded children who were not the model of healthy, happy lives. Of course, we were not really discarded, but because we were sequestered far from home, friends, and anything remotely familiar, we felt discarded, tucked away, set aside, set apart for what seemed a time without a real beginning and an unknown end. We learned to exist in another world of routine and to be wary and alert in the midst of lulling sameness. No adult told me what to do on my first morning at the preventorium. I followed the other girls, got out of my bed, stood next to it, uncertain what to do next. I watched and followed as one little girl went to her locker, took out a toothbrush and went to receive a face cloth and then to line up in front of a large communal bathroom. I too went to my locker, which had been shown to me my first evening the night before, and reached for my toothbrush on the top shelf. It was new, a small pink one. I walked toward the line of girls, some sleepy and rubbing their eyes and faces, some chattering away. I peered around them to see that the bathroom had 5 sinks, 2 very elevated large bathtubs with steps, and a separate shower room off to the side. There were 5 enclosed toilet stalls in another area. As I waited in line to wash my face and brush my teeth, I looked down at my bare feet and listened to the general hum of voice. The little girl behind me poked me, and I saw that the line had moved forward. She asked me, "Did your parents leave you here yesterday? I saw you walking through the circle room last night. What's your name?" Without waiting for my response, she pointed at the 2 nurses ahead of us, telling me which one was nice and which one was not. We watched 4 little girls standing at white sinks set low at child height. They washed their faces, brushed their teeth, splashing water, and then moved to the toilet stalls. When it was my turn at the sink, I copied the little girl next to me. I folded my washcloth into a square like she did, and then held only the tip end of the corner of the square under the water, so the cloth got wet only on the top part of the middle. I found this confusing, but I did it anyway. Smiling at me, the little girl whispered, "This is so water doesn't drip down your arms." The 2 nurses were still standing at the doorway to observe everyone. Each held a clipboard and questioned each little girl coming out of the toilet. They then wrote furiously on the clipboard to report the answers. "Yep," my friend giggled at me, grinning. "They write down every time we go to the bathroom." Horrified at the thought, I watched the other children as the questioning continued. Finally, our teeth brushed, our faces washed, our personal hygiene, as the bathroom process was called, was completed. Then, still in pajamas, we all walked out into the hallway and lined up in front of an open cupboard at the wall where a nurse stood taking items off the shelf to hand to each little girl. One by one, we stepped in front of the nurse, putting our open palms together like accepting an offering. The nurse gave each of us a pair of white bloomers. This was rhythmically repeated, the nurse reaching in, taking out a pair of bloomers, placing them on the open palms of the little girl in front of her, who then went back into the ward to put them on. The next one behind her stepped forward to receive her bloomers. I followed along, imitating the others. In my fresh, clean bloomers, I stood, observing the busy, bustling room and listening to the sound of locker doors closing. For many children at the prefectorium, the bloomers were a badge of shame, embarrassing, and worrisome in their looseness, for we wore no underwear. I thought they were wonderful. I enjoyed the freedom from heavy clothing. I wouldn't have minded running around naked, but the prefectorium staff had a limit. Bloomers were always required except for sleeping when we wore regular pajamas. In cooler weather, we had white cotton sleeveless V-neck shirts, and in fall and winter, we had a 3/4 length sleeve sweater to wear outside, along with sneakers and socks. But most of the time, we just wore bloomers. Thankfully, I never saw anyone try to pull down another child's bloomers as a joke. We were all in the same situation, and besides, shame was more likely to come from an adult than another child. In the summer, we looked like little stick figures puncturing dozens of white cloud bloomers. Photos of us are startling and unsettling to viewers. How odd it must have been to see a room full of children in little fluffy white bloomers, all arms and legs and feet. The daily routine is burned into my brain. Morning after morning, we removed our pajamas, folded and placed them in our locker, and then unashamedly pulled on our bloomers and gathered in the hallway. We were all little clones with the same haircut and those white bloomers. I had arrived at the prefectorium on a warm May afternoon in 1959, having recently turned 6 years old. That day, I became a patient in a hospital that was part of a major medical movement grown out of the widespread horror of tuberculosis. Never well known by the general populace, these hospitals are now almost completely forgotten, but at one point they were prevalent across the country. Now they seem alien to any modern sensibilities, and yet they were lauded for bringing children back to health. In writing this memoir, I connected with many others who had been patients of the prefectorium in Mississippi. Many of us questioned the reality and validity of our histories, our memories, and experiences. We wondered if we had simply imagined our time at the crematorium. For a majority of us, our time at the crematorium hospital was never discussed with family and friends, and we shared a universal need to have our memories and experiences validated. Crematorium movement was considered quite progressive at the time, and the number of crematorium hospitals across the country peaked during the years of the TB crisis from roughly 1900 to 1935. But many remained in place much longer than that. Gradually, the hospitals became institutions for the care and observation of children who were deemed to be at risk for TB or suffering from other illness such as asthma, rheumatic fever, being extremely underweight, or the like. The Mississippi crematorium was one such hospital that lasted longer than most, and Mississippi at one time had the highest rate of death from tuberculosis in any other state. However, no child at the McGee, Mississippi crematorium ever contracted tuberculosis. In 1959, I was considered an extremely at-risk child, resulting from numerous bouts with asthma, bronchitis, pneumonia, and being severely underweight. My father had died in 1957 when I was 4 years old. It's very clear now that I was really suffering from his loss. But in the late 1950s, no one considered psychological reasons for children's ailments. For 15 months, the crematorium was all I knew. For all of the children there, the crematorium was the world. While there, I and the other children had no sense nor any knowledge of what might be happening in the world beyond the crematorium. We were not essential. The world did not need me nor any of the other children. We were caught in a universe of precise routine, yet had no sense of time passing in any meaningful way. And we had no knowledge of our homes either. Time is relentless, even when it seems to stand still. When there's the same specific routine day after day, hour after hour, night after night, unique moments make certain times stand out from the word. As children, we all felt eternity in small, still moments. We were trapped here, and no one was coming for us. There was a sense of release in knowing that we had no options, a relief in the submission to the inevitable. And I do have a picture. There's me and my bloomers, the fan that I had gotten, and the schedule. And you can see with that schedule that was very rigid. It was followed for the entire existence of the Mississippi crematorium, time of 1929 to the time it closed in the mid-70s. And you can see that there are plenty of options for personal hygiene. And this is my book is going to be published September 15th. It's being published by the University Press of Mississippi. And this is a cover of me, a picture of me looking at my mother's purse. And there is, in the way that I connected with the other patients, is that while there were several crematoriums in New York State, Mississippi had one crematorium, McGee, Mississippi. So, and at that time, in 1959, Mississippi was still a very rural state. It did have Jackson as the capital, but even Jackson was smallish. It was, there was it's not a very sophisticated place. Most people tend to think of Mississippi as very rural. And even though it's progressed and it's changed very much since then, at that time, people kind of knew each other all around. So one of the things that happened is in the early 2000s, when I went down to the Mississippi Archives to do research, writing this memoir, I found out that there was a Yahoo group of people who had been in the crematorium. And slowly over time, that moved into a Facebook group. And I find it absolutely fascinating that there is a McGee, Mississippi crematorium Facebook. It's closed. It's only open to members of the group. And in doing research for my memoir, I reached out to them. They all wanted me to share their stories. And I said, I will protect your privacy. Fascinating to me is that they said, use my name because it validates my memories. Because talking about the crematorium became, for many people, a badge of shame. They didn't want to share it because it's such a weird experience. And so everyone that I connected with really wanted to have their experiences validated. And when we shared photos of each other, we realized just how isolated we were, even though we were in groups. There's a big group, 20 little girls, 20 little boys. Because you always are in such a rigid schedule, and you were always monitored constantly, you really didn't form those friendships. So we would share pictures to say, do you remember me? I was fascinated by the need of these children to be remembered. So I'm going to stop because we have about 20 minutes and people probably have questions for Carol, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions. I do just want to, because Ann Mazer is not here to be with us. You may know Ann Mazer. She's a well-known children's author. She wrote several wonderful books to Salamander on this one. And she was going to read a haunting story about the lost voices of children called Forgotten. And it's in this book, Forgotten by this short story. It's Sudden Flash Youth, 65 short stories. It's a marvelous story. So I did just want to show that book in case anyone wanted to find the book and read the story that she wrote. So are there any questions for Carol from anyone? I mean, I have a question. Yeah, that's my question too.
Short answer.
Once you stay here, just stand side by side.
Okay, you stand here. Lamentations is associated with Job, of course. And it was his conversation and his and what happened to him in his relationship with God. My feeling was that these are lamentations because these were the comments and reactions to women who had no control over their lives. And they had joy in this. It's not a terrible book. But it felt to me that Lamentations described their reaction to their world, which was very much a female world inside a male world. And so for me, it was a lament. And so that's why I used it. The University of Nebraska said, well, that's a great title, but we need to have more. So the subtitle is Novel of Women Walking West, which explains it.
I in reading the book, I love the detail and the details about the boots and wearing them out. And did you have to do research on Passion of the Day?
No,
did you just
no,
was it in the diary?
no. I have read so much about this. It's just I knew all this. And the people mentioned who are in Ithaca, because the Tompkins family starts in Ithaca, are all real. They come from the census or what I know. So the boots were made by George Frost, who was a well-known boot maker in Ithaca in 1840s. So I used as much as I could, but no, I didn't.
That was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a question for Susan, and that is, we started this whole session by talking about lost voices, what voices we were bringing forward out of the past. And mine were historical voices, they turned into fiction. And Susan's were real voices. Who was the hardest person to portray in your life?
I had one really close friend to make one really close friend. And I didn't use any real names in the book because many of these people are still alive. And I don't know where she is because I never got to say goodbye. So that was a little bit challenging. The others it's all first person. It's my experience. So it's things that I describe on what's happening.
Was it hard to describe your mother? Because your mother had to leave you there.
Yes, I mean, it was a real. Writing this was a much more of a journey of discovery than I expected, because It was a very, it's not an easy topic for my mother because she was 29. My father died very unexpectedly. She was left with a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. I started to develop, I've been healthy up until then. Lots of health issues that was perplexing. And the pediatrician told her that I needed to go to Victoria or get healthy again. And she didn't feel she had a choice. But each time I tried to talk to her, she made her angry. She felt very defensive. I think it probably made her feel like she was a failure as a mother. So I waited until she passed. Actually, the story. But spent a lot of time talking to my brother and his memories. So, and I learned a lot about my mother talking with him because that 2 years of being 6 years old, such a bigger, different perspective.
I've been with Susan on this journey for a long time. We started as a small writing group here at the library. There were 5 of us. And when Susan first started to talk about pre-Victorian, it was sort of a happy time in her life. She didn't remember it as, you didn't remember it very clearly. You had created a happy space. And you were a feisty, interesting little girl. I'd like to say, I think you made your own happiness there. But over the course of writing, Susan has come to see this quite differently.
It has always been a shameful secret for me. Something I never ever told anyone. It's something that I talk about in the book. Is that so? If I did tell people, I usually said, "Oh, it's like summer camp," because that's kind of what it looked like. But it was never a happy memory for me. Something that really haunted me. It's haunted me forever. But and I think it has most of the children who are there. Nothing terrible to be there. You'd see some terrible things happen to other people. And I certainly know of other things, but there is one history of the pre-Victorian. It's called Saving Sacred Children. It's written by a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Cynthia Connolly. And actually, when I was working as an academic librarian, sitting big up to libraries, the book came out. I got in touch with her and said, "Oh, I was at a pre-Victorian. I don't think I had that experience at all." She said, "Oh, I wish I had interviewed." We kept in touch with her. And then my mother passed away in 2015. And I found an envelope of photos. That photo of me, those 2 photos that were in there. And I was like, I had flashbacks suddenly seeing these pictures because I remember the exact moment when these pictures were taken. And then we had a couple of reunions at pre-Victorian, so I went to them to meet with some of the other children patients. I began to do a lot of research. So very different book than I expected to write. So yeah, thank you.
But we both looked for lost voices. And I think Susan learned a lot and she's created a beautiful book. And you probably still have voices in your head too.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. I hear from the people who were there. Yeah. Heard.
It's mentioning books there that there's a book called When Women Count.
Oh, right.
Which the college copy. And the cover is American Gothic. The man, or the woman is not there. And the whole point of the book is that over years the government didn't like I worked with young women students. They want to write about women history. I said, well, no, nobody really cared to collect it. So we don't have a number of men that were farmers, men, etc. But women's stories and children's stories.
Yeah, the children were never asked. So, I mean, for the pre-Victorian, actually in the early part of the 20th century, 1920, often people coming from other countries, their children were taken from them immediately and put into pre-homes because there was an assumption that parents could not take care of their children. You know, and by 1940, the whole idea of taking children away from families was debunked. So that, you know, they proved that it was not, there was no efficacy in taking children. And speaking of lost voices of women, one of the things that was particularly interesting to me is that you talked with your friend who had the letter. And so, I mean, I wonder how many letters of women are out there that people still have that describe some of these experiences.
I think there's a lot of material still out there, but the Oregon Trail was the American story for a long time, and it only has been supplanted by the Underground Railroad more recently. But it was the American great story because it completed this country across the continent. And that whole idea of manifest destiny has really meant that we overran the continent. And without thinking, and I tried to show that in the book, that they thought they were doing the right thing, the patriotic good thing, was going to people the Oregon Territory so that the British couldn't take it. And if you went to school, nobody went to school when I did, but I went to school when they used to talk about 5440 and fight. Well, I came out of school thinking we got 5440. We didn't get 54. We got 49. So it was one of those things that has been misrepresented or was misrepresented, and the idea that we owned this and that we could take it over. And it seems to me that there is still material out there, but the Oregon Trail is one of those big topics about which there are some wonderful books. Certainly there are great histories, and the histories are tremendously important, starting with Francis Parkman's book, The Oregon Trail, done in the 19th century. And they're still great historians of the Oregon Trail. And there are historians of the women's voices on the Oregon Trail. But in 1842, when Dr. White got his company to Oregon, he was so reviled by Oregon historians that he gets written out, and Oregon starts the Oregon Trail era. The next year, when Marcus Whitman brought 900 people, that's when the Oregon Trail starts as far as Oregon is concerned. But I think the story of the Underground Railroad has usurped a lot of that these days. That really is the big story that people are writing about.
So the lost history, certainly this medical history has been lost. And Dr. Tompkins was a person who spoke about it. Her theory, she actually did a preface to my book. And one of the things that she writes about is that the reason this sort of medical movement, I said, how can a whole medical movement just be forgotten? She posits that it was not good, to take children from their families and keep them in a hospital. It didn't work out so well. They don't really want to advertise it. But I think, to me, there are some parallels in the pandemic of 1918, because until recently, we didn't really pay too much attention to 100 years ago. There was a pandemic. It wasn't until we started to have our own pandemic, 100 years later, that we started to some of these things. We learned a little bit about it down in Abbey. But, so medical movements and medical research is lost art unless you have personal.
There is a quite wonderful book by Michael Lewis called A Premonition about medical workers, a county health officer in California and some doctors who gathered in Washington about how to plan for what should be done about a pandemic, and they were ignored.
And so Michael Lewis is the same one who did
Yes.
The Big Short and
Yeah.
Moneyball.
Moneyball.
Yeah.
Yeah. it's a wonderful book.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful story.
Yeah.
Momentous time for coming out of it. This, the stories are captured right now.
Well, you think about their books like Emily saying, and her Station, she wrote Station 11, and her latest one, I don't know, but the first one was about Station 11. So we're going to start to see, and if you've read Louise Burbridge, her latest book is about a bookstore in Minnesota that is a case where this woman is Native American. It's in the bookstore selling books, they're doing curbside delivery, and the bookstore is haunted by a woman who dies during the pandemic. So I think there's starting to be a huge trend for publishing books written during.
I think the other thing is that when the pandemic started, a lot of people began encouraging people to write memoirs of it. And I think we're going to be overwhelmed with memoirs. And sometimes that's not too useful. But a lot of people have documented their time during this pandemic.
There's been a lot of documentation. Cornell has had a project where people are invited to write, sign up to write, fill out a daily diary. It started very early on, so they're collecting research, but they're still collecting. So that will be fascinating to see what they do. So,
You're very kind.
yeah,
Thank you so
much
much.
for coming.
I hope
And
we've
thank you to
inspired you.
everyone on the live stream as well. We really appreciate everyone tuning in. Thank you very much.
When we meet, we show up afterward.
Thank you, everybody. Yay, the first spring rights event. Thank you. We can stop the, thank you, live stream people. Yay, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you very much.
Did you have fun?
It was really fun.
And it's also going to be taped. So you're going to send it to your friends.
Great. My brother could